Welcome to Diverse Joy. This is a podcast where two so-called experts put the joy back into diversity discussions. My co-host is Dr. Amber Nelson.
And my co-host is Dr. Wilcox.
So, Amber, why so-called experts?
Big part of it for me is when we're talking about conversations around diversity, I personally kind of fell into my roles in these spaces around doing diversity training and conversations. And I'll talk more about that as we talk about our stories and how I got here. But in each space, I just kind of expected, at the next level, there's going to be experts, right? They're going to know, they're going to do this really, really well. And I'm going to learn so much more about how to do diversity well, how to do inclusion. And I would get to the next level and I'd get disappointed and think like, well, shoot. And then I'd ask a question. They're like, oh, that's a really good question. Why don't you facilitate a conversation around it? And I'm like, but I'm not an expert, but I can have a conversation. And so I kept expecting that when I got to college, when I got to grad school, when I got to internship and postdoc. And, I've trained at really, name places that have really great names, and there have been people that did the work, and also that there was still a lot of room to grow. And so why I don't call myself an expert, because I don't feel like I have all of the content, but I do feel like an expert in having the conversation. And that's the thing that I'm good at. I'm an expert at sitting in the space, facilitating conversation, but I don't think I can ever call myself an expert on all of the content of what it means to do diversity work and diversity training.
Well, and one thing that you said in the conversation off mic, you were like, well, I would call you an expert.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was like, no, but I would call you the expert. Like, and I want to echo what you said. And I always think of it as, if when you say expert, it sounds like it's so like the period, like the end of the sentence. And with these kind of diversity related topics, what it is about, it's about us getting to know one another and the many diverse, different kinds of ways of being there, are ways of seeing the world.
Right.
And so like even in the bias habit breaking training I do, sometimes people want answers.
Yeah.
And I'm always like, I can't give you the answers. I can give you tools that help you work on things, that help you find answers, help you be more open to things. But it's, there's new stuff that could pop up at any point. So we kind of decided our tagline is going to be so-called experts putting the joy back into diversity.
Absolutely. And like I said, a big part of doing this work and doing the trainings is more than a commitment to all of the content knowledge, is a commitment to being a lifelong learner, to staying curious, to updating the information. And that's one of the things, what our first episode, we talked a little bit about bad diversity training. And some of that I have seen is that people that get into diversity work don't necessarily always stay up on the most current information or update their training and make sure that it's reflective of what the youths are talking about, like what's really happening right now. And that's part of it too, is like making sure that we're staying current, that we're updating, that we're adjusting frameworks to what's happening in the world today, and not keeping it just because it has worked in the past, or this is my signature and I'm not going to update it. Whereas that's something that you do really, really well, is in this training that you've developed over 15 years, like you're constantly updating it and creating new videos and creating new slides and bringing in
doing a new podcast,
bringing in new research. And that's what makes it, the expertise is the staying current and continuing to commit to the learning process.
Awesome. So we're some so-called experts.
So-called experts, yes. And, again, we're the so-called experts bringing joy back into these conversations. Yes. So, what's bringing you joy?
Oh, man. So this is our episode for August. And so during this time of year, one of the big things that brings me joy is the Bristol Renaissance Fair. So this is a Renaissance fair that's here in Wisconsin. And it's an actual like physical small town. It's not like a tents that drive from town to town and set up. Like they actually have buildings and a little castle and all this stuff. And from midsummer to later summer, me and my friends go 2 or 3 times, and we sometimes dress up or sometimes just come as our average selves. But we have lots of fun. There's jousting and falconry.
Oh my gosh.
And lots of us just, hanging out in a kind of weird and different environment where, it's getting out of our kind of reality.
Yeah, for sure.
And, some people dress up as like Star Trek people who are,
like exploring a new planet. I love it.
They have a pirate day where everyone does everything a little more piratey.
Yeah.
Once I went as dressed as Superman.
Love that. Why not? Why not?
And there was like a Renaissance-y Superman I got to meet there. Like,
that's
who did a
cool.
Superman costume with, leather and armor and all that kind of stuff. And it's just a really joyful, fun thing.
That sounds like so much fun. I've always wanted to go to a Ren Fair. I've made or bought like Ren Fair costumes several times, and I've just never had the chance to like go for one reason or another. So one day I'll go. Maybe I'll come and visit and go with you all.
Yeah, maybe one of the times that we do the recording, we can leave time for that.
Yes,
and do that. Yeah,
that would be amazing.
So, what's bringing you joy, Amber?
Yeah, I was trying to think. There's lots of things bringing me joy, but fairly recently, I had this. We're talking about our identities today, right?
Yeah.
And I had this really great experience with my family where my mom just really wanted to spend time with my brother and I and teach us some family recipes. So I'm half Italian. My mother's Italian, and she just took the day for us to learn how to cook our Nona's long sauce. So it's a long sauce, spaghetti sauce. Some folks will call it gravy. But using traditional methods where you hand squish tomatoes and like all of the different ways in which my grandmother made her like most famous like sauce that everybody requested and everybody loved. And it was just such a beautiful time to like sit with my family and connect to our heritage, connect to my ancestors, and have this recipe passed down. Like, I'm not necessarily the biggest cook. My brother is. He's a fantastic cook. I did not inherit that gene, but for us to now have this shared recipe.
I was just about to ask you to cook for us. But maybe we need to ask your brother.
My brother would be much better at it, but I can do this long sauce. But the long sauce, it takes all day, and it's supposed to sit and simmer and just get pull all the juices and all the flavor out. And so it's just a really, really cherished memory that I have now, and like also this connection and this recipe that I now know how to cook differently than if I were to have just read it written down, like actually doing it. Learning. Yeah, like actually having my mom walk us through and us do that. And she also taught my sister-in-law too. So it was just like a really lovely time, and every time I think about it, it brings me so much joy. So yeah,
that's beautiful.
And like I said, we're really talking about our identities, right?
Yeah,
and
let's get into it.
Why don't we just get into it? So like, do you want me to start? You want?
Go for it.
Okay, yeah. So like I said, I am I'm half Italian, and I'm half Black, and I think there are lots of parts of my identity. I grew up in Southern California, and when I was fairly young, we moved to Southern Oregon, which is a really rural space, predominantly white. I was the only person of color, one of the only people of color in my entire school, and I grew up with my mom, who's Italian, right? And my dad wasn't really in the picture, so I grew up with a single mom. And I said in another podcast, like, my mom worked really hard to make sure that we were tied to our cultural identity, our racial ethnic identity. She always exposed us to literature to the community. She wanted to make sure that we understood our Black identity, which I think is really special as a biracial person. So biracial. So there's actually this acronym. I'm kind of jumping all over, but there's this acronym developed by Pamela Hayes, and it's called the Addressing Model, ADDRESSING. And it's just an acronym to help like give you some places to think about what are some identity markers that we have. Yeah. So it stands for age, disability, neurodevelopmental disabilities, disability acquired, religion, ethnicity, socioeconomic status or class. Some people will say class, sexual orientation, indigenous heritage, national origin, and gender. And so for me, I'm a millennial, right? I'm a millennial, and it comes up in so many ways. I even tease my students, like, do not call me. Like, I'm not gonna answer the phone. Like, text me. If you're gonna call me, text me first so I can prepare myself to answer the phone. Like, I'm a millennial through and through, which also has its connotations around how I understand economics and like everything else. I also have ADHD, if you can't tell. Like, it comes out in a variety of ways in which I manage my life and how I interact with people, how I tell stories, how I teach. I identify as a Christian, and I work in a Christian institution. I am in Christian spaces a lot of times, and there are lots of parts of what that means to me as a Christian, as somebody who understands themselves to be very progressive, a progressive Christian. So I'm Christian. I'm biracial, but I identify as Black, and Black and biracial, really. But I present myself to the world as a Black woman, right? Yep. And so that also has different things to that. When I was growing up, I didn't know how to identify, and I would ask my mom, like, what am I? Because I'd get that question all the time, like, what are you, right? And she's like, baby girl, you can identify as whatever you want to identify as, but you also need to know that the world's going to see you as a Black woman. She's like, you're just as much Italian as you are Black. Like, you can identify as Italian if you want to. And I tried it, and people didn't accept that, right? When I would go around calling myself Italian, people didn't really accept it. And it took me a while to hold on to, like, okay, I am biracial and I can identify as a Black woman, and both, they don't have to be one or the other. Both can exist at the same time. And that was a journey for me. But yeah, so that's my ethnicity. I was raised middle class. My mom actually, we had a lot of resources, and I'm very blessed by that. I went to private school, my whole upbringing. But I also grew up, my mom was a caretaker for adults with developmental disabilities. Oh. And severe and persistent mental illness. And so I also had a very interesting family composite, because I grew up with these folks in my home, and it changed the ways in which I understand communication and so many different things, and my socioeconomic status and where all of that played, because we were housing so many folks in our home. Wow. So there's that. I'm a straight woman, and I'm from the U.S. and not from outside of the U.S. And again, I identify as a cisgender female. So there's so many parts to that, right? Like rural, there's biracial, there's Black, there's and professionally, I'm a clinical psychologist, right? Yeah. Even though sometimes I have a really hard time recognizing that I have changed socioeconomic class status as I have a doctorate, yeah. Right? I have 5 degrees. I have a doctorate. I'm a professional that my socioeconomic status and my resources has shifted. And sometimes I have a hard time accepting and reminding myself of that. And then I'll say things. I'm like, oh yeah, that's where that's my privilege. That's where it's coming out. But yeah, so that's a little bit about my background. And you have some similar things as far as having so many different influences in your background.
Yeah. So one joke that I threw out at you a little while ago, I was like, we're look at how diverse the two of us are. Like,
Right.
you're a PsyD, I'm a PhD.
Right.
Man, woman, I'm
Yeah.
gay, you're straight, you're
Yeah.
Christian, I'm atheist. We kind of the only thing we have in common is we're both white.
Both
is
white.
the joke.
Right.
So because she's biracial, as she said, and we're both not.
Right.
So, for those of you who can't see me, those are your listeners. I'm 100% white appearing, but my family's mixed. So my father's white, but my mom is Native Hawaiian, Chinese, and Portuguese. Now that's further complicated by the fact that I'm adopted.
Right.
So I'm the oldest of 5 adopted kids. And going basically by looks, 3 of us are white, and then I have a brother and a sister who are Puerto Rican descent, and that's my family.
That's beautiful.
Now, my adoption was arranged before I was born, so the only culture, ethnicity I know is kind of the white American mix on my dad's side and this kind of Native Hawaiian heritage on my mom's side. So Native Hawaiian, Chinese, and Portuguese, but even the Chinese and Portuguese family was in Hawaii since the 1850s.
Wow.
And as most people at all familiar with Hawaii Native Hawaiians are very much a mix of a lot of cultures from colonizers and so on. But my grandfather, actually, his percentage of Native Hawaiian was really high, so much so that he qualified for this program that Hawaii had, where if you were Native Hawaiian of a certain percentage, and the whole percentages game is its own conversation.
That's a whole other. But
he got a couple acres of land and a house built on it, which now my family lives. Some of my family lives there. My cousins and aunties. So my Hawaiian ancestors were actually in the Waipio Valley on the Big Islands. But this brings us to some of the kind of complicatedness of it. So, like, am I a person of color is a question.
Right.
As someone who's white appearing, I know anything, if we ever talk about like privilege kinds of things, no one ever treats me differently because of the color of my skin.
Right.
They see me as a white person. But I actually have a good friend, Chelsea Minamura, who also is from a very mixed race kind of family. And she was like, no, you're a person of color. That's who you are. That's your heritage. Is that Hawaiian and mixed heritage. What I end up saying, if I'm expressing this, is complicated.
Yes, yeah,
like,
for sure.
I will always acknowledge being white appearing, but I'm Native Hawaiian. That's a huge part of who I am.
Yeah.
So I mentioned I was adopted. My parents were in the military, and so I actually grew up all over the world.
Right.
I was born in Germany. And lived a few places in Germany. I went to 1st through 3rd grade in Germany. But before college, I'd never lived anywhere in my life more than 2 years at a time.
Wow.
So I've lived in Kansas and Florida and Texas.
Yeah.
Spent a few years living in Korea, South Korea, in 5th and 6th grade. And so I tend to identify with what some people call a third culture kid.
For sure.
Because I'm not just any one U.S. culture. I'm
Yeah.
not just Hawaiian culture, I have been influenced by so many things.
Yeah.
And that really feeds into what I ended up doing as a profession. Like, I spent my life seeing that people see the world in so many different ways. Even just in the U.S.
For sure.
Like Kansas versus Florida versus California.
Right.
People see the world in different ways. And that was always a part of me growing up and my understanding of the world growing up and interested me. I mentioned I'm a gay man. You talked a little bit about your career path.
Yeah.
So because I grew up this way, I would see how my siblings would get treated differently based on the color of their skin.
Yeah.
That's maybe stories that I'll talk about at some point in this podcast. But my sister's very, very dark skinned to the if we're talking just skin tone, she's a bit darker
than me. Yeah.
I'll save the stories, but I saw her get treated differently.
Yes.
And so race and thinking about these things always was a part of my life. And when I got to college, so I've always been very scientifically minded. I was maybe going to be a chemistry major, like really do scientific work. That excited me. And I took a social psychology class.
Yeah.
And when I learned, wow, there are these people who scientifically study these kind of social issues and, builds theories theories and experimentally test them and really use data in that way, that just tickled the crap out of me.
Yeah, I love that.
And I just loved it. And so I went and got my PhD. And as we've already talked about I've done all this work with the bias habit breaking training, which seems to really be having a big impact on people's lives, the people who go through it. And so I've kind of devoted my life to that kind of work. And I now use this term, I call myself a scientist practitioner.
Yep.
So I still do a lot of the hard science experimental work, but then also this practice, the going into workplaces, giving this training, using the science to help people make progress. Yeah. And that's also what this podcast is.
For sure. And I would identify as a practitioner scientist, right?
Perfect.
Practitioner scholar. That I do the clinical work first, but I also do the research, and I do the clinical research around it that then feeds back into my clinical practice.
Our friendship was just meant to be.
I know.
Right? And professional. Yes. Click. Yes.
Absolutely. So interesting. I didn't know your kind of chemist background and science. I also was pre-med in college and thought that I wanted to do medicine. And I got waitlisted for med school, and during that time I decided I'd get my master's in counseling, because I thought, well, if I'm going to do work with people, I should know how to like come alongside them. And when I was in my counseling grad program, I realized like, man, I really like working with people and understanding people. And it was also at that time that I realized I did a lot of work and research around biracial identity development, because, that's the me search of research, right? Okay, well, this is my lived experience. I don't really see a whole lot of this reflected in the literature. And it was one of those first times that like my faculty was like, this is really good and important work. And I didn't ever think that my lived experience could be something that would be something that could contribute to the literature base, right? That could help other people. And it's a lot of like what you're talking about. Like I got so excited and geeked out on the like social science pieces of it. And I went clinical route, but I still do the research on the back end that then supports models and supports our clinical work moving forward. So I love that. Yeah.
Listeners and viewers, now you've learned a little bit about us and our background. I think our stories are going to have a little bit more of that when we get to story time.
For sure.
But first, we are going to take a break.
Great.
So, see you in a bit. So for our outfits today, we wanted to wear stuff that was kind of tapping into our race and culture, like we've been talking about. So I have this shirt that says "Raised on Rice," which is definitely true of my whole upbringing in my house. Just about every meal had rice. And actually, my mom and grandma sent me a version of this shirt. They sent me one that was like 5 times too big for me. So
had to find a version of it.
For this podcast, I found a smaller. But it's a tank top, so it can also show off my tattoos, which are done in a Hawaiian-inspired tribal design. They're actually Pokemon.
Yeah, they are.
But done in a Hawaiian tribal-inspired design. And I'm wearing a lava, kind of skirt wrap.
That's really cool.
And Amber was appreciating these uli that I have on display in my house, which is where we record.
Beautiful, yeah.
Growing up, my mom had a pair exactly like this that was always like somewhere in the house. Traditional Hawaiian kind of thing. And then I didn't know which pride things I wanted to bring out, but this is my Native Hawaiian pride flag.
It's beautiful.
It's a flag. So the flag of Hawaii is based on the British flag.
Right.
And so Native Hawaiians people, some of us anyway, have adopted this flag as kind of just our native pride flag.
The reclamation flag, right?
Ooh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, love that.
And
my outfit is, I'm wearing a head wrap, which I wear head wraps frequently. some of that is due to culture, and I don't like doing my hair. So wearing my head wrap and being able to connect with my culture as well as not doing my hair is a perfect combination. And then I'm wearing an African style dress and Kara fabric, and I think it's just beautiful. It's I don't know if it has a specific cultural country of origin, but it's by this company called Ray Darton, and they are it's all of their clothes are African inspired and African prints, and so being Black identifying and African American, I really like to wear things that are part of the African diaspora, and we can talk a little bit more about that because again, I'm not really connected to a specific country, but like Black and African diaspora experience. So I love wearing African inspired clothing.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Oh, so it's a special treat for you visual viewers.
Yeah. All right. Well, welcome back. And we're actually heading into our story time segment, and like we normally do, we kind of have one story that's maybe a little bit more of a negative story, and then a positive one. And Will, you had a short story to share with us that
Yeah, so, in our talking about identities and things, sometimes our identities relate to traumas or sad things in our life. And so I mentioned at least briefly, I'm a gay man.
Yeah.
But what I didn't mention when talking about my family is they're Mormon. So I was raised Mormon. And I... for a while when I was in high school, was realizing that wasn't right for me, and definitely being gay and being Mormon
wasn't compatible.
Yeah. And so I came out to my parents when I was 17, and it really did not go well. There was lots of yelling and screaming, and they... I was still living with them for a few months after I came out, and like at one point they found out that I watched an episode of Will and Grace, and then they were blaming that for making me gay. And
I mean, representation matters, but
yeah.
I don't know if it's going to turn you gay.
It doesn't. So it was really unpleasant, both due to me not being part of their religion and being gay. And so this all kind of came to a head one day after I turned 18. My dad and I got into a big fight in the car on the way home from somewhere. He said something along the lines of, "You just love stabbing a knife into me and your mother's heart, don't you?" And I said to him, "Don't be dramatic."
Yeah.
And he pulled the car over, took my backpack out of the back seat and threw it in a ditch and told me to get out. Yeah. And he actually said, "That's dramatic," and then drove off and left me there on the side of a freeway.
Wow.
And so kind of became the gay youth homeless statistic.
Wow. Yeah.
And I was lucky that I started a long walk back into town because we kind of lived in a suburb of Tallahassee, Florida, where we lived at the time. And I found a friend. I have a friend who worked at a hotel downtown, and they had a business center. And I went to the business center and finished an English paper I had due in the class the next day.
Wow, yeah.
I don't know how I finished it because I was understandably upset,
traumatized.
Yeah, and slept on people's couches. I was really lucky. Some drag queens actually took me in and let me live with them. Awesome. And it was rough. It was poverty. We were in a not great trailer park during that period of my life. I actually got some skin infections that only pop up in third world countries, allegedly, developing countries. Excuse me. And flesh-eating bacteria.
Wow. Yeah.
And but I got a job. I worked at Wendy's. I was also lucky that someone was willing to give me a job, and stayed in school, all that good stuff. And my parents and I have since made up. There's still always some of that tension in the background. Sure. But I've forgiven them, and we have a good relationship now. But it's still a part of my past, and something that So like you said, we always have a negative story. So
For
that one's
sure.
maybe particularly extreme. But
yeah. And, we didn't really talk about intersectionality, right? But when we're talking about our identities, we do have so many different parts of ourselves that intersect and make things, better, worse in different spaces and times. And man, I'm really sorry that is part of your story. And as somebody who identifies with the church and Christianity, I think that it's something that, like, the church has various sects of Christianity and religion has really done a lot of harm. And I'm really sorry that was part of your experience. And that it has been transformative in your life too. And
yeah, it informs my research and what I do with my life, just like my other experiences.
Yeah.
So some positive things and then some negative things out of it.
For sure.
So, having that poverty in my background,
right.
Definitely leaves its mark in how kind of stable I feel financially, even when I have a nice, regular job.
Yeah.
And my sense of community is really important to me. So like here in Madison where I live, I've really built a wonderful chosen family of people who I can feel safe and connected to. That means the world to me.
Yeah.
And so, we all make our way through life figuring these things out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's important that we don't, and not to say that you have to always spin your trauma into something positive. But understanding how, whether that's our experiences, our identities, and how that informs how I understand myself today and how it impacts, again, sense of stability and community and how it grounds my values too.
Absolutely.
And so I think that there's a lot about that for you.
Thank you. Yeah. So always bringing the joy back in.
Absolutely.
So you had a positive story that you thought would fit with today's episode.
Yeah. And again, centering our identities and our lived experiences. So, like I said, I grew up in rural Oregon, and then I moved from rural Oregon, so it's a little tiny town called Klamath Falls, to just outside of Portland, into another small town called Newberg, Oregon, where I went to school. And I then left and did some time on the East Coast in Boston and Baltimore for my internship for my postdoc, and I stayed and worked out there for a little while. And it was one of the first times when I lived in Baltimore that I lived in a predominantly Black space. So Baltimore is a city that's 60% Black. And so it's from the space where I was like one of the only, if not the only, Black person, and coming into this space, and all of a sudden I wasn't the only one. But I also was stepping into, while the social spaces and the community was predominantly Black, the professional space wasn't necessarily predominantly Black. And I'll never
the medical
establishment exactly.
Even there,
whereas the city is, so influenced by Black culture and Black folks, that the medical establishments still were not necessarily reflective of the space. And I stepped in, and I'll never forget one of my first Black patients when I was in Baltimore, and they said that, behavioral health psychologist was going to be meeting with them. And I came in, and the look on their face and their grandparents' face was just a pure joy. And I didn't understand it at first. And then they were just like, I didn't know that you were going to be our doctor, that you were going to be my doctor. And they couldn't even necessarily explicitly say, because you're Black or because you're brown. They just kept like rubbing their skin. Like, I didn't know that you were going to be this, and like just rubbing their hands, rubbing their arm, and indicating that I was, a representation of them, that they were going to have a doctor that looked like them, especially a psychologist that looked like them. And it was such again, we've said several times, we'll continue to say several times over, that representation matters, and it matters in every space, not just in our media and our movies, but in our healthcare systems and in the providers that we see. That having that changes the way that we understand ourselves, where we see ourselves going. one of the people that I work with in the nonprofit space, he always says, like, you can't beat if you can't see it, right? Yeah. And so, like, with kids, and I work predominantly with kiddos, like them being able to see me as their doctor, feeling comfortable, feeling like they can be fully seen was one of the most life-changing experiences, I think, for me. Knowing, that's amazing. Yeah, knowing what it meant for me to have made it here, not just for me, but the pride that my patient and the grandmother kept saying, like, you made it. I'm so proud of you. Like, and I was like, you don't even know me. You're so proud of me. Like, this means so much. And there's just something really meaningful and special about that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I love that. That makes me so happy. Like, I'm just smiling here. I'm like, yeah, that's amazing. And I'm glad that you're out there doing that too.
Thank you.
Doing all that good practitioner work.
Yeah, the practitioner work. Yep.
Awesome. So as always, we have a question. So you listening, we're starting off with a battery of questions that were generated by my students. Yep. But if you are a listener or a viewer, please send your questions in. If you go to diversejoy.com, you'll be able to submit, and we hope to address some of your questions in future episodes. But tied in with these topics today, is race a social construct?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I would say the ways in which we have operationalized it, right, and how we understand it and use it in particularly our country, it is, right? Like, it is a social construct. And while there are, ethnic pieces and cultural pieces, but the ways in which we kind of arbitrarily define it as skin color, right, and define one's race based on that, regardless of cultural heritage, is absolutely a social construct, and something that makes it very nuanced and difficult to deconstruct and talk about, and it makes it really hard for multiracial folks, folks that are white appearing, right? How do I hold on to my identity as, I don't know, someone who's Native Hawaiian and multiracial, or I have several students that are half Mexican but are white appearing and grew up with their Mexican family, and people dismiss that part of their heritage. And again, it reminds it's indicative that race really is a social construct. It doesn't have anything to do with the heritage.
And bring up the Latin American or Hispanic ethnicity. That's also something that, so the U.S. Census has defined race as white, black, Asian, Native American, and I think that's it. And then there's that separate question we always have on things. Are you Hispanic Latino or not Hispanic Latino?
Yeah.
And it's because by these older definitions, they were trying to make race this this quantified thing.
Right.
And then they're like, oh, Hispanic versus not Hispanic isn't race.
Yeah.
It's ethnicity, and it's separate. Whereas now, the way colloquially people see things, like being Latin American is a race. Being Hispanic, using the terms that people use in everyday life, that is kind of one of the races. You're black, or you're Hispanic, or you're white.
Right.
But then that gets weird in U.S. Census and other kind of official forms that are dictated by the government. So that's one example of, it's a social construct. It's kind of made up and arbitrary. Secondarily, it's changed over time. So I don't remember if we said this on the air or off the air, but Italian people often were not considered white back in the day.
Absolutely.
Irish people also, there was a period of time of that, where, and they're I want to get the wording on this exactly right. I recently saw this paper from a bunch of geneticists that were all coming out and saying, by and large, in the field of genetics, race is not really a useful tool. The social construct of race doesn't translate down very well to important genetic things that we as geneticists study. Of course, there's a gene that influences melanin, which influences skin color. But this treatment of race being the whole person and everything about them, not as useful as other indicators.
Absolutely.
And so kind of abandoning race. And although lay people often think of race as this very biological thing,
Right.
not so much.
Right. Exactly. There's this book called Caste by Isabella Wilkerson. I don't know if you've read it. It came out 2020, like right as the pandemic hit, which was bonkers because there was a lot of things in it that were just very of the time and of the moment. But she really talks about race in America as caste systems rather than even using race as the construct. And she looks at it across different cultures and compares how we use race as more of a caste system than really anything about our ethnicity or our culture.
Oh, and that, what that makes me think of brown paper bag tests and blue blood tests. So if the listeners or viewers don't know what those are, there were churches in the South that would literally hold a brown paper bag up to your skin. If you were darker, you went to the black church. If you were lighter, you went to the white church. And then the blue blood test is whether you can see blue blood vessels through someone's skin color. Right. And so this is, again, part of that arbitrary thing. There's someone who could be a strong black woman who's light skinned.
Right, absolutely.
That by those old tools gets classified as white. And it just seems this dichotomous thing. It's like,
yeah,
no,
absolutely. Or even going back to one drop rule too. Like, if you had any person of color in your background, no matter how far back, you are that. And so again, it goes to like, that's that biological like thought and discounting somebody's like actual heritage and culture and representation.
Yeah, and then it gets, again, in our examples, for me, it gets all mixed up because, like, okay, going one drop rule, well, I'm a person of color because my mom's a person of color.
Right.
Oh, wait, I'm adopted.
But,
and then
and
in modern discourse around diversity, which is so much of what we like to talk about, and how it's gotten toxic in a lot of ways. Especially sometimes around discussions of whiteness, like anything where I present myself as other than white is by others sometimes would be perceived as he's not acknowledging his privilege, he's trying to get away from white guilt, or there are all these other things. And it's never been that for me because I've always seen myself this way, but just in modern discussions it's gotten complex.
Absolutely. Well, and again, it's just like you can be white and Native Hawaiian and all of these things. Like, they don't have to live in exclusion to the other. Right. I am biracial, and I have just as much Italian influence as I do black influence. And in some ways I have more Italian influence than I do black influence. Being raised by an Italian mother and my Italian family being really, really close to them. And I can identify as a black woman, right? Like, having all of that cultural heritage and those ties, and being black. I'm biracial and I'm black, and I don't have to say but, right? When we say but, we're like discounting the things before it. So I'm not saying like I'm Italian but I identify as black. I'm biracial and I identify as a black. That's where again, just as a joke, we're not really gonna make this our tagline, but the idea two white people talking about diversity and they're also not white. And people. Also not white. Yeah. Exactly. Well, and it's so in thinking about kind of all of what we're just talking about around our multiracial and one drop rule and brown paper bag and all of these things, what, we do these habit breaking skills, and I'm wondering what skill do we want to talk about today?
All right. Awesome. So today's skill is called impression justification. Or the concept we're learning about is impression justification. Our skill is learning to identify it so we can disrupt it. So impression justification. What this involves, so stereotypes, these biases that we learn, these habits of mind that we like to talk about, they set up expectations about what other people are going to be like. In a previous episode, we talked about, it leads people to expect that you're going to be a great gospel singer.
Right.
They expect that a gay man's going to be great at shopping and fashion. We have these expectations from stereotypes.
Right.
And one of the things that happens is your brain really likes it when the outside world matches its expectations. Because your brain wants to know it's doing a good job of predicting what's happening out there. So when something matches your expectations, it actually activates your brain's reward system, gives you kind of a good gut feeling. You feel good good about something matching your expectations. And when something doesn't match your expectations, it gives you kind of a bad gut feeling.
Right.
But this can play out in very consequential ways if we're talking about things like hiring or judgments and decisions you have to make about other people. For instance, so let's imagine that we're in charge of a hiring decision for a role that maybe is very stereotypically male.
Right.
Where traditionally we tend to think of men in that role. Well, if you have a man applying to that male stereotyped role, that matches the expectation. It's easy for your brain to process that. Your brain likes that expectation match, gives you that good feeling.
Right.
And so you start off evaluating this male applicant with that good gut feeling, and you interpret everything through that lens of thinking positively about him in that role. Then let's say we have a woman who's kind of trying to break into a role that hasn't traditionally been filled by women, or isn't at least the stereotype expectation. Well, a woman in a male stereotyped role kind of doesn't fit for your brain as readily. Your brain has to do a little more thinking and working at it. And so it gives you a bad gut feeling about her as an applicant. And then you interpret things through that lens. Yeah. And it can lead to something that we also call reconstructing credentials, where you change how you interpret the value of different things that someone might be bringing to the table because it's through this lens of these gut feelings.
Right.
So, and this is why it's called impression justification. You get that initial impression, and then you kind of look for evidence on the resume, if we're talking about a hiring decision, like I am, look for things that support that gut feeling. Right. And what ends up happening is, in the end, you kind of have built a story around why the man's right for the job.
Right.
And have justified it. And so we want to start learning about how that initial impression happens, so that we can be aware of it, and so we can try to disrupt it, not let ourselves just kind of jump into something and let our gut feelings kind of drive what we say or decide.
Absolutely. Yeah, and from a clinical perspective, we would call those schemas, right? Like we create schemas of understanding, and sometimes those are based in sometimes they're based in stereotypes, sometimes they're based in, what am I trying to say? Survival mechanisms, right? And things like that they can be based in that, and then they get exacerbated and overgeneralized in certain spaces. And so, for instance, like snakes are scary, right? Like I might build this schema, then it gets overgeneralized to like not only are snakes scary, but they're dangerous and this. And so then even if I'm seeing like a little tiny garden snake, right? Like not harmful or anything like that, all of a sudden I am like overgeneralizing it to like this dangerous, scary thing, or I am creating some sort of justification for why I was harmful to this little garden snake is because it's dangerous and scary, obviously, because it's a snake, therefore justifying that initial impression, right? Yeah. And so we call those like schemas and things that we want to address when we're sitting with anything. And how do I reconstruct schemas that we have? And adjusting, like, okay, we've talked about this before. Like, I'm having a gut feeling about this. What is that gut feeling? So what is it? Detect, reflect, reject, right? Along with this understanding, this impression justification piece.
And I'm going to give a little preview of something that we're going to spend more time on later. One way to short circuit this is, before you're even in the situation, to think ahead about how you want to make the judgment, how you want to, like, what qualities are important for hiring someone in my hiring example I was just doing. Because if ahead of time you've thought it through, then you're not relying on the gut feelings as much. You've said, I'm looking for someone who has 4 years of internship experience.
Point blank period.
I'm looking for someone who's published 3 papers. Whatever the things are that's important for the decision, think it through ahead of time. So then you look for those things rather than kind of getting this, I'm getting an impression.
Right.
So we'll talk about thinking ahead more when we use that as our official skill in one of these episodes. But I want to give that little preview.
And that's really good too, because the research also shows that we're kind of bad self-evaluators, right? Like we're not good at like actually identifying what do we know and what do we not know, and how good are we at those things. And so being able to have like essentially a task list, like I'm looking for X, Y, and Z point blank, and I'm sticking to this, that can really help with us trying to do our own personal evaluations, trusting our gut in those kinds of situations.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. So we also like end our segments on something fun, something that's bringing us joy, that's just a good recommendation for folks to kind of check out. And you have one for us today.
I do. I would like to recommend the TV show Superstore. You can get it on, I'm looking at my producer, hold on. It's on Hulu right now. Yes, it's on streaming on Hulu right now. And hopefully will still be when this comes out in a few weeks. But it's a really great show. And sometimes what we talk about on here is, a given show centering a particular type of experience,
right,
and that being part of everything you consume media-wise. You want diversity in the breadth of what you consume.
Right.
And a single show doesn't necessarily have to have all the diversity in
right.
it. This is a show that is
actually does.
Actually does. So Superstore has people from all different kinds of racial groups. One in particular I want to shout out is there's a character, Sandra, who is a native Hawaiian, which when I first saw her on the show and heard her talking about her heritage, it made me feel so good, because you never see Native Hawaiian folks.
No, you really don't.
And she reminds me so much of my aunties, and Hawaiian family members, and just made me feel good. But they have Black folks, disabled folks, gay folks, Asian folks, and it doesn't come off as forced diversity,
right?
Which is a term I don't like, but that people use for some things like that, because it's like everyone working in this big store, like it's supposed to be kind of like a Walmart or a Target,
right?
And it's like you can easily imagine, there would be a ton of different kinds of people working there. And sometimes they have an episode that talks about race stuff. There's one storyline that has to do with immigrant related issues, but overall it's just a bunch of kind of goofy people being fun, having fun,
being
and
community.
And it just brings me joy, which is why we're sharing it, right?
It's so good. It's definitely just campy and fun. It's just a fun, lighthearted comedy. But yeah, I agree. It doesn't feel like they're trying to make the diversity things an issue, right? Or a focus of any of the topics or episodes. It's just more naturalistic, and I think it makes it really special and fun. Yeah.
So definitely check it out. So that's our time. So I'm Dr. William Cox.
And I'm Dr. Amber Nelson.
And produced by Eric Roman Binding with music by Jay Arner. Diverse Joy is consumable as either an audio-only podcast or a video podcast, both accessible at diversejoy.com. Diverse Joy is the official podcast of Inequity Agents of Change, a nonprofit devoted to the dissemination of evidence-based approaches to reduce bias, create inclusion, promote equity, and enhance diversity. All that good Jedi work.
All the Jedi work.
You can learn more at biashabit.com. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.